All right. So, in just about 1 minute, we're going to go live. So, uh, now would be a good time to get your notes together, um, or get your pen and paper together. Get ready to take notes. So, um, since this is my first, YouTube live, my first attempt at YouTube live for lecture purposes. If you have a question, type it into the chat, and hopefully I'll see it. If you could see what I'm looking at here on my screen. In fact, I'm going to send a test. All right, I should be able to see it if you type a question in the chat. It is 7 p.m. Eastern time, so we're a minute into this, so we're going to go ahead and get started. So this is our first lecture for the history of Christianity, or the first lecture covering content. Our first lecture, we covered the syllabus and talked about expectations and things like that. So this is our first content-oriented lecture, and just going to ask you to forgive me as we move through this. I'll be drinking some coffee. I had COVID a couple of weeks ago. For those of you that have had the Omicron variant, the sinus stuff sort of sticks around. So I've still got some drainage, and excuse me, there you go. And so the coffee sort of helps with that. So as we move through this semester, just want to say a few things about something that's kind of been on my heart, something I've been thinking about. We will look at the history of Christianity, and we will see ebbs and flows in the history of Christianity. We'll see times when Christians were revealing considerable strength and attachment to doctrine, and then we will see times when Christians lost their way, similar to the story of Israel, and developed idols. And I live in the southeastern United States. I live in Florida, and I'm from the state of Georgia. And some people think that college football down here is an idol. I don't think it is. It's something certainly that we care a lot about. It's something that entertains us. It's something that our families can. I don't really like this hat. It's something that our families can gather around the TV and root on our favorite team, and and spend time together, doing things that we love. And for me, I think I like the other hat better. For me, I'm a big Georgia Bulldog fan, and sure, I've got a miniature commemorative Georgia Bulldog helmet that I keep in my office. And sure, sometimes, when I get thirsty, sometimes I will drink from my commemorative Georgia Bulldog mug, and then I'll set my Georgia Bulldog mug down on my commemorative Georgia Bulldog coaster, and come on, it's not an idol, right? I mean, it's not like I have a commemorative plaque for the 2021 National College Football Championship, right? So it's not like it's an idol, right? But anyway, kind of was just thinking about that, and thinking about the idols we have in our life, and how things will sometimes challenge our affections. Sometimes it's college football, and sometimes it's other things, but I don't think I have a problem. I think I'm okay. But anyway, let's get into the lecture for the history of Christianity. Hold on a minute. I need to move this picture that I have of former Georgia Bulldog and former Dallas Cowboy Herschel Walker out of the way so that I don't drop it and break it. All right, let's get started with the history of Christianity. So now that I've wasted almost 5 minutes of your time, when you think about the study of church history, Christian church history, typically you'll see that it is divided into two big categories. The first category is the history of Christianity. That is the study of notable people, notable events that help us to understand Christianity as a religion. In my world religions class, I try to study the history of, Hinduism and Buddhism and Judaism and Confucianism and all the isms. Like, I try to study the history because I think learning the history of the religion helps you to understand the practitioners of the religion. So you have the history of Christianity. And the second major category that you have is historical theology. That is the study of the notable people, events, and doctrines that were developed over the course of time. What we're going to do in this course, since this is an undergraduate introductory course to the history of Christianity, or the history of the Christian church properly, is what the title of the course is. We're going to sort of blend those two things, and we're going to bounce back and forth between people, events, and the development of doctrines, the responses to external threats in terms of, unorthodox beliefs or heresies, and internal challenges that we'll study as we move along. So in this lesson today, we're going to cover the period of time between Pentecost, which is the Pentecost as it's the Feast of Pentecost as it is as it is detailed by Luke in the second chapter of Acts. So from Pentecost to the year 325, that's where we're going to really spend a lot of our time, from Pentecost to really the first ecumenical council. As we consider the history of Christianity, I think the first place we start really is getting our minds wrapped around the political, the cultural landscape. So those of us that have read the Bible and read through the Gospels understand sort of the geographic center of Christianity was the ancient land of Israel, which the modern nation of Israel covers most of that today. But this tiny nation in the Middle East, on the Mediterranean. So as you think about this tiny nation and how this tiny nation fits into geopolitical events globally, you do that typically by thinking about the various empires that affected the nation of Israel. So starting in 721, you have the Assyrians who invade and displace Israel. 586, the Assyrians are replaced with the Babylonians. Babylonians come in, they invade, they displace Israel. And the interesting thing, and we'll talk about this a little bit in just a minute, but the interesting thing about this Babylonian captivity of Israel is, even though this was generally seen, at least from a theological perspective, as a divine act based on Israel's turning away from the truth, turning away from the covenant. For the most part, the Jews had a very positive relationship with Babylon, the city of Babylon, for centuries after the Babylonian Empire fell. So from an intellectual standpoint, from a theological standpoint, Babylon will come up again in this timeline. So the Babylonians are then replaced by the Greek Empire, Alexander the Great. Now, this is where we really start to see some of these geopolitical events affect the future religion of Christianity. So here's some interesting things to note about the Greek Empire, about Alexander the Great. So obviously, Alexander, his army, his nation spoke Greek, right? And so when Alexander would come in and conquer a nation, he would write the peace treaty in Greek. So what this caused the people of that nation to have to learn Greek so that they could abide by the conditions of the treaty. Now, Alexander's reign was very short-lived, just 12 years or so, but his influence produced something historians call Hellenization. And what Hellenization is, it's the adoption of Greek language and Greek culture by non-Greek speaking people. And so throughout this region, this Mediterranean region, you had all of these nations that adopted Greek as the language of trade, because all of these nations were trying to keep the conditions of the treaty. They learned Greek, their children learned Greek. And so when you started to have interstate commerce, international commerce, really, between these nations, the thing that bound them together was the language of that treaty. And so by the time the Romans, grew their empire from the city of Rome to all of these, covering all of these nations and even more that Alexander conquered, by the time the Romans show up, with the exception of Rome and Italy, all of their conquered lands, for the most part, spoke Greek, which was a common language. And so this is very important to think about when we think about the genesis of Christianity, and particularly the formation of the New Testament, which was written in mostly Greek, some Aramaic, but written in Greek. And so the people of the first century, when Jesus lived, the people in the first century, in first century Israel or Palestine, the average person would speak and read Hebrew. The language of the day, the average language, was Aramaic. And then everyone, the literate people, not everyone was literate, but the literate people could read and write in Greek. And so you get to the New Testament, you get to Matthew, Mark, Luke, John, you get to Paul, right? You get to you get to James, you get to these New Testament authors. They may understand Hebrew, they may speak daily in Aramaic, but when they got ready to write a letter, they would write it in Greek, because they knew that the church to whom they were writing would understand Greek. And so it's an interesting way that developed. And so moving forward on this timeline, right, you got the Assyrians, Babylonians, Alexander the Great, the Roman Empire. So in 63 BCE, let me just time out there. So you may have learned in high school, maybe your first years of college, I don't know, you may have learned the designations AD and BC, right? BC, before Christ, AD, Anno Domini, which is a Latin term meaning in the year of our Lord. In academics, generally speaking, over the last probably decade, there's been a shift away from BC and AD to BCE, which is before the Common Era, and CE, the Common Era. Now, they cover the same periods of time, but in academics, there was this shift because globally, as the internet and it got more globally, you've got a significant portion of the world that do not measure time in terms of before Jesus and after Jesus, right? It's not relevant for the Indian subcontinent, which is 99.9% Hindu, or some of the nations in the Middle East that are nearly 100% Muslim, or the Buddhist nations and things like that. And so it's not wrong to use BC and AD. Nothing wrong with that. There's also nothing wrong with using BCE and CE. And so, generally speaking, in academics, graduate school and things like that, you'll start to see less BC and AD. And it doesn't have anything to do with Jesus. It doesn't have anything to do with denying Jesus. It's just a designation to to transcend cultural norms, which those designations weren't created until much, much, much later than when Jesus lived anyway, so it doesn't matter. But in 63 BCE, General Pompey and the Romans took over the rule of Israel, and they became the formal overlords of the Jews in Israel. So when you look at the political and the cultural landscape of Israel, you had this interesting relationship with Rome, and it's a relationship that Rome would duplicate in other places. But essentially, you had the nation of Israel that had their own laws, right? As part of their theological ethos was the law of Moses. It wasn't just a religious law, it was a social law. It was the way that they conducted their political society, was through the law that God gave to Moses on Sinai. So what the Romans decided to do was they would let the Jews have their law, and in places where the Jewish law conflicted with Roman law, generally speaking, depending on whomever the governor, whoever was governing Israel, the province of Syria was what the Romans called that whole area. But whoever was governing that area, they used their own judgment to say, well, we're going to let Roman law supersede Hebrew law, or it's not a fight I'm willing to fight, so we'll let the Jews do their own thing. The other thing that's interesting to note, and this will matter later for Christianity, is that in the Roman Empire, you had the Roman pantheon of gods, which was essentially a knockoff of the Greek pantheon, but the Roman pantheon of gods. And then Judaism. Those were allowed. Judaism was a legal religion because it was the religion of the people when they came into the Roman Empire, and it was a civilized religion. It wasn't considered a pagan religion by Roman standards. Anything that was not legal, any religion that was practiced in the empire that wasn't legal, was considered atheism. So you either abided by the legal religions, or there are times when you would suffer at the hands of the Romans for being an atheist. And typically you would see negative interaction between Rome and whatever this atheist religion was, because there was some practice that conflicted with Roman law, or something like that, or there was not the necessary or proper respect given to the emperor or whatever. So that's sort of the political landscape. You had all these various empires that swept through that area, and the nation of Israel was caught up in all of that. And so by the time Jesus is born in 3 to 4 BCE, we'll get into that later, why he wasn't born in 1, but he born in 3 or 4 BC. By the time Jesus is born, the Romans rule Israel. Israel has a law, but they're allowed to practice that law as long as it doesn't conflict with Roman law. And then you have essentially the known world that communicates based on interstate commerce in the Greek language. And so into this, Jesus is born in the southern region of Judea. Israel's broken up into regions. The southern region of Judea, raised in Nazareth, which is a city in the northern region of Galilee. In 30 CE, Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem, which is the capital city of Israel, also located in the southern region of Judea. After Jesus lived, died, in 70 CE, you need to remember this date, not just for a test. You need to remember this date because this is a common thing you will discuss when you discuss Christianity, or when you begin at some point teaching through or preaching through the Gospels, or even some of the Pauline epistles. 70 CE is a very important date in history. That is when there was a revolt in Israel. The Zealots rose up against the Roman government. And in 70 CE, the Romans sacked Jerusalem and destroyed the temple. Now, if you go to Israel today, if you go to Jerusalem today, you will see a huge stone wall And you'll see Orthodox, a lot of ultra Orthodox, a lot of Orthodox Jews praying at this wall. They sometimes take prayers, write them on paper, and stick the prayers into the crack of the wall. We call that the Western Wall. We call it the Wailing Wall. It is literally the Western Wall of the temple that was destroyed in 70 CE. Now, I want you to think about that from a Jewish perspective, going all the way back to when God gave the law on Mount Sinai. You have this establishment of a sacrificial system for the propitiation of sin, the payment for sins. You have this sacrificial system where an animal has to die, and that's all done in the temple. You have once a year, you have the Day of Atonement, high priest, sacrifices for the sins of the nation. So the temple cult, and I don't mean cult in a bad way, like a cult of Christianity. I mean like the religious activity that was involved in the temple came to a screeching halt in 70 CE. And so the reason I say that is because the Judaism that you read about in the Gospels, or that Paul refers to in the Pauline epistles, or whatever in the New Testament, that Judaism doesn't really exist the same way anymore, because when the temple was destroyed in 70 CE, not only was the temple destroyed, but Jews were exiled from Jerusalem. So the thing that was really the most important, I guess, structure, the most important part of the Jewish religion, at least from their perspective, no longer existed. So from 70 CE to today, Jews have had to figure out how to be Jews without sacrificing according to the Jewish law, without the temple. So 70 CE is when that happens. When that happens, and the Romans exile the Jews, a lot of Jews went to Babylon. Here Babylon shows up again. And over the next several centuries, Babylon would really become the theological center and the intellectual center of Judaism. So that's sort of a political and cultural landscape at the time when Jesus is born. So we know the Gospels, right? We know Jesus' life, we know his death, we know his resurrection. After his resurrection, before his ascension, according to the Gospels, Jesus gathers his followers together and he says, I want you to go to Jerusalem and wait for the promise of my Father. He had spent all this time in John. If you read the farewell passages of John, John 14 through 17, call them the farewell passages, because this is essentially Jesus saying goodbye. And in those passages, we have an introduction to the Paraclete, parakaleo, one called along beside. So there's something going to be different about the Spirit of God once Jesus leaves. It is important for you that I go away, because if I don't go away, the parakaleo, the Paraclete, will not come. So these followers take Jesus' word seriously, and they go to Jerusalem, and they do just what he said. They wait. After his ascension, 120 of those, that is chronicled in Acts chapter 2. And it includes that moment where the Paraclete comes. There are tongues of fire. You have in that same story the conversion of 3,000 Jews that are in Jerusalem. So from that Babylonian exile, not in 70 CE, because this is all before 70 CE, but when the Babylonians exiled the Jews, not all Jews came back to Israel once they were able to. They would they settled in all of the surrounding countries, but they would still travel to Jerusalem for the various feasts like Pentecost. So if you read through that story in Acts chapter 2, all these people, according to Luke, who's writing this historical account, all these people are in Jerusalem for the Feast of Pentecost, who have settled in these other areas, and they speak the languages of those areas, and they hear their own language, and they marvel at this. Peter preaches a sermon. He gives a very long quote from the prophet Joel, and Luke records that 3,000 people became Christians on that day. Now, there's some parts of that story that we don't have, right? We have to think through some of those parts of the story as it pertains to the history of Christianity. Now, one of those things is that, okay, we have this conversion of all these 3,000 people who don't live in Jerusalem. So you have 3,000 people that accept Jesus, no doubt are baptized, because that's what the early church did. We still baptize, right? That is a cardinal Christian doctrine. We do that because that's what Jesus said do. And so these 3,000 were baptized. Well, at some point, these 3,000 people went home after being baptized and after, we assume, spending time with the apostles, learning about Jesus, learning about what was different about this. And so a lot of historians believe, including me, that these converts that left Jerusalem, went back to their homes, started churches in their homes. In fact, I remember in college when I took a class called the Book of Romans. Our professor, who was a Pauline scholar, he did his dissertation on Pauline theology. He was as smart as anyone I've ever met. He surmised that he believed, with no proof, this is just his theory, that the church at Rome was probably started by people who were present on the day of Pentecost, because we know that Paul didn't start. None of the apostles started the church at Rome. If you read through the book of Romans, Paul is introducing himself to the Romans. So from there, from Pentecost to these 3,000 people that go out and start churches in their homes, for the first 2.5 centuries of Christianity, congregations met in people's homes. Christians really didn't start building buildings until the mid 200s, really. And so when you're reading through the Bible, and the church at whatever, church at Ephesus, the church at Laodicea, the church at Smyrna, whatever, what that's referring to is either one singular church that meets in a home. Most likely it's referring to many home churches in a city. And so if Paul writes a letter to the Ephesians, to the church at Ephesus, most likely he would write that letter, and it was intended for all of those home churches who would often get together and celebrate the Eucharist together. But home churches, that's how Christianity grew, inviting people into your home. Preaching, like we understand preaching, wasn't really the norm for Christians. They would gather for fellowship. They would gather for prayer. They would have communion every single time they met. And if someone had a word of prophecy, you'd have the spiritual gifts that were in operation. You have people that would prophesy, or people that would speak in tongues and interpret those tongues. And so that's really, if you think about the New Testament church, and I think it's important that you do that, because when we think of church, like if I say, tell me about your church, you're going to instantly have this visual of a congregation of a certain size, and pastor most likely at the front. And like the church I go to, we're another campus, so we have several campuses for the church that I go to. In the church that my family and I go to, we meet in a high school, a local high school. So when you say, hey, tell me about your church, what's your church look like? I think, well, we park in the student parking lot, walk up to the school, go into the auditorium, and there's Creekside High School banners everywhere. And so whatever you think of when you think of your church, I want you to start thinking of the New Testament church a lot differently. So if you think of the church at Ephesus or the church at Corinth or whatever, you had churches, you had people that would come on Sunday to celebrate the resurrection of Jesus, to pray together, and they would meet in homes. And these homes were almost always the person that would host these homes were women. Now, women had a very important role in leadership in the early church. And so that's really what you saw. But as the church grew, as these home churches grew in size, and as the ministry of the churches of the church, right, or the congregations in each city grew, there arose a need for leadership. And we see that for the first time really in Acts chapter 6. So if you, when this lecture is over, if you want to open up your Bible, read Acts chapter 6, what we see that there's a dispute in the church over how widows are getting food distributed to them. And so the church's response to that is to create the role of deacon. And the interesting thing about the role of deacon is that this was a role that would survive from the apostolic age until today. It is a cardinal Christian church office, the office of deacon. And I would even argue that it is the oldest surviving Christian office. There are arguments that it's not, but most Protestants don't really consider that, or let me say it another way, most Protestants consider that the age of the apostles ended with the death of the disciple John, or the apostle John. Now, there are some Christian churches that still uphold the office of apostle, and it's fine. It's fine. There's nothing in the Bible that prevents it. But generally speaking, most Protestants would say that the apostolic age ceased when the apostle John. That's what I believe. And so what that means is the office of deacon is the oldest surviving Christian leadership, and it's a position of leadership in the church, and it is a position of ministry in the church. Their primary role was to physically hand out food, was to touch the people to whom they were ministering to. Now, Stephen, if you remember that, remember the story of Stephen, he was a deacon. He was a leader among the deacons. He was the first Christian martyr. The stoning of Stephen, that event, if you read through the book of Acts, that event emboldened the Jewish leadership. So Stephen gives a fantastic sermon, enrages the Jewish leaders, and they stone him to death. Well, killing Stephen emboldened the Jewish leadership to double down on their persecution of these followers of Jesus. This led to a dispersion of Christians out of Jerusalem and into the regions of Judea and Samaria. The apostles stayed in Jerusalem for the most part during this brief time. And as time went along, although Peter had been the spokesperson for the apostles, it was James, the brother of Jesus, the author of the book of James, the New Testament book of James, that became the de facto leader of the church. Now, I'm not going to get into that. If this was a class on the book of James, we spent an hour on it, but we're not going to. But James was the de facto leader. And so from the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus until the 60s, most of the Christian leadership remained in Jerusalem while missionary activity took place in the other parts of the Roman Empire. Now, when the Romans came in and destroyed the temple in 70 CE, it wasn't just the Jews that dispersed, it was also the Christians. So in 70 CE, the Christian leadership that was alive in 70 exited Jerusalem and went to live elsewhere, including John. So we have the cultural landscape, right? You have all the empires, you have that influence, you have the development of the Greek language. Jesus is born into that when the fullness of time. I want you to think about that. When the fullness of time came, Jesus came. So the fullness of time meant when history prepared the world for the Messiah. And part of that preparation was this, for the first time really in human history, this part of the world, generally speaking, was united politically. It was united in language. the Romans built roads. Which, by the way, here's a little trivia that's going to help you win trivia night at Applebee's. Do you know why our train tracks are the width that they are? So when the Romans built roads, when the Roman army would travel down these roads, their wagons would leave ruts, would leave tracks. So if you had a wagon and you wanted to travel the Roman road, if your wagon tracks didn't match the wagon width of the Roman army, you couldn't travel on the road. So wagons were built according to those specifications, and that went all over Europe. So pilgrims land, we start building wagons in the United States, we build them by those same specifications. So wagons that were built in the United States met the same specifications of a wagon from 6 BCE when the Romans were building roads. So when we started building trains in the United States and train tracks, we built the train tracks the same width as wagon tracks so that we could roll the wagons on the train tracks. So today, when you drive across a train track, you're driving across a track that is the exact same width as a Roman wagon from who knows when. I don't even know when those were built. So you just stick that under your hat at Applebee's, and when they ask the question, you're going to be a star. And I don't need any thanks, but just send me an email. Let me know that you won because of that trivia question. All right. So moving forward, Jesus is born, he lives, he dies, he's resurrected. The church begins to grows really quickly. 3,000 converts that then go to the different areas of the Roman Empire and start churches. You have leadership that is built in the form of apostles and then deacons, and then eventually elders would oversee each congregation. And among those elders was the pastor. That was one of the elders, because similar words were used for that. And then the temple is destroyed in 70 CE. The church continues to grow, but the leadership's not in Jerusalem anymore. So as the church grew, so in the beginning, when you had Christianity, the Roman government really didn't see any difference between Christianity and Judaism. In fact, they considered Christianity just to be a branch of Judaism. Now, remember what I said at the beginning of the lecture, that there were legal and illegal religions in the Roman Empire. Judaism was a legal religion. Well, as soon as it became clear that Christianity was not just a branch of Judaism, suddenly now Christianity is an illegal religion. So even though sort of in the first 300 years of Christianity, the Christians represented maybe around 2% of the population of the Roman Empire, they made a lot of noise. In the earliest days of the church, the Romans began to question the practice of the Romans began to question the practice of Christians. And because of the language Christians would use to talk about communion, Jesus said, "This is my body," right? "This is my blood." So people who didn't understand, including the Roman leadership, began to suspect that that Christians were cannibals, and that they were eating other people and drinking their blood. And this suspicion grew and grew and grew. And as this suspicion grew, you began to see some persecution of the church. There was a man named Fronto who was Marcus Aurelius's teacher. Sorry, I had a hard time getting that out. Here's what he wrote to the emperor about Christianity. He said, "Now the story of their initiating novices is as detestable as it is notorious. An infant concealed in a meal so as to deceive the unwary is placed before the one who is in charge of the rites. This infant, hidden under the meal, is struck by the novice, who thinks he is striking harmless blows, but kills him with blind and hidden wounds. Horrible to relate, they drink his blood, eagerly distributing the members of his body, and are united by this sacrifice and pledged to common silence by their awareness of guilt. So this misconception of the Eucharist made persecution really easy, because who wouldn't want to put a stop to that, right? So the Romans were like, this is detestable. They're eating babies. And so whatever good qualities the Christians showed, and they did show some good qualities, there are some features of Christianity in the first 300 years and even beyond, but we're talking about those first 300 years. There were some features of Christianity that really stood out. Number one was they fed the homeless. Nobody cared about the homeless in ancient Rome, but the Christians took it upon themselves to feed the homeless. Babies. Nobody cared about babies. If you had a baby and you didn't want it, you just would take it outside the gate and put it outside the gate, and nobody cared. And that's just how they did it. And dogs would eat the babies, or wolves or bears or whatever wild animals, or they would just die and decompose. But the Christians would rescue those babies, and they would find homes for those babies. So from the first days of Christianity, they were extremely concerned with life. You could really call them pro-life. My pastor makes that comment in some of his sermons about early Christianity. Taking care of widows, making sure that women whose husbands had died were taken care of. These were all features of Christianity that everybody could see. But it was the suspicion that they were a bunch of cannibals that made them very easy targets. And there's this story that you need to know through the history of Christianity. It's a very interesting story. So in the early 60s, Nero was the emperor of Rome. And now we know this now, but when it was taking place, not a lot of people knew it. But Emperor Nero wanted to expand his palace. He wanted to build some temples, but he couldn't, because there was the places where he wanted to build them in Rome were occupied. They had businesses on them. Well, in 64 CE, somebody started a fire in Rome that burned for 6 days, and it burned 10 of Rome's 14 districts. It almost decimated Rome. And so Nero blamed this small group of people that everybody thought was cannibals anyway. He blamed the Christians for the fire, and he encouraged Romans to take revenge. So he personally had Christians beheaded, put into the arena to fight gladiators, put into the arena to fight wild animals. One of the most notorious stories about Emperor Nero was that once he had his palaces built, he had all these buildings built, he would throw parties. And at least at one party that went on into the evening, he attached Christians to poles around the area where they had their party. And when it got dark, he lit the Christians on fire. Now, they were alive. He lit the Christians on fire, and their burning bodies provided light for the party. So this was probably the most significant persecution. It's not the only one. It's the most significant early persecution of the Christian church. And it is very likely that both Peter and Paul died during this Neronian, this persecution by the Emperor Nero. In the 3rd century, there was another persecution, sort of a widespread persecution, because I don't want you to think that from the time Jesus ascended until sometime in the future, Christians were just nonstop persecuted. That's not really an accurate picture of what happened to Christianity. There was persecution based on these suspicions. Most of the persecution was localized. It wasn't this widespread persecution. And so there was, in the 3rd century, Emperor Decius required all Roman citizens to sacrifice to the gods regarding his well-being. And this was to be done in front of the magistrate. Once they did it, they would be issued a certificate called a libellus, saying that they had made the sacrifice. If a citizen was stopped by an authority and asked to produce a libellus, if they had one, they were free to go. If they didn't have one, then they were taken to the magistrate and they were given the opportunity to sacrifice. If they did sacrifice, they would be issued a libellus and all would be good with the world. But if they didn't, then that's when the trouble started. They'd be put in jail, or they would be put into the arena eventually given multiple chances to give the sacrifice, but ultimately, if they did not, they would die. Jews were exempt from this because their religion was legal, but many Christians were killed because they did not sacrifice. But many Christians did sacrifice. It was a big problem in the Christian church, caused a lot of division because once the Decian controversy was over, once people were no longer required to make that sacrifice and get that libelous, you had all these Christians that would show up at church who had sacrificed, and as far as the leadership of the church was concerned, had turned their back on Jesus and denied him. It's a huge problem in the third century church. But all in all, that's some of the larger, more prominent attempts at persecution. So all these periods of persecution, all these suspicions about Christians led leaders in the church to pen apologies. Now, the Greek word apologia doesn't mean I'm sorry. The Greek word apologia means to defend or defense. So these Christians would pen apologies or defenses of the Christian faith to high-ranking Roman officials between the years 100 and 300. Some of the more notable apologists: Justin Martyr, Aristides, Athenagoras, Theophilus of Antioch, and one of the most notable was the epistle to Diognetus, written between 150 and 225. So I'm going to read a portion. If you're looking for a good book, if you study history of Christianity in grad school, you'll probably end up with this. I don't know if you can see that. I don't know if it's backwards on your screen or not, but the Apostolic Fathers. This has several documents in it. I'll show it to you here. On one side of the page, you've got the Greek text, and on the other side of the page, you have the English translation. This one is translated by Michael Holmes. It's a standard. Like, I'll never be without this book. So the epistle to Diognetus is an apology written about Christians. And here's what Diognetus says about Christians. This is a beautiful epistle that reveals some of the more notable things about Christianity. For Christians are not distinguished from the rest of humanity by country, language, or custom. For nowhere do they live in cities of their own, nor do they speak some unusual dialect, nor do they practice an eccentric way of life. This teaching of theirs has not been discovered by the thought and reflection of ingenious people, nor do they promote any human doctrine, as some do. But while they live in both Greek and barbarian cities, as each one's lot was cast, and follow the local customs in dress and food and other aspects of life, at the same time, they demonstrate the remarkable and admittedly unusual character of their own citizenship. They live in their own countries, but only as non-residents. They participate in everything as citizens, and they endure everything as foreigners. Every foreign country is their fatherland, and every fatherland is foreign. They marry like everyone else and have children, but they do not expose their offspring, meaning that they don't put them outside the city gates to die. They don't expose them to the elements. Listen to this one. They share their food, but not their wives, meaning they were sexually pure and committed to their spouse. They are in the flesh, but they do not live according to the flesh. That sounds like the Bible. They live on earth, but their citizenship is in heaven. He just goes on, and I don't have a lot of time to read it. I'm not going to read the whole thing. But so you had, in response to the suspicion and in response to the persecution, you had these apologies that were written. And so I want to back up for just a minute and talk about the formation of the canon. So during the first several decades of Christianity, when the apostles were alive, their writings, so their letters to churches, became sacred to the Christian community immediately. And we call those the canon. So The term canon is Latin for ruler, like a measuring tape, like a measuring rod. So we refer to the Christian scriptures as canon because it is these documents that are the measuring rod for all Christian belief and doctrine. So we refer to the scriptures as the canon. The 27 books that make up the New Testament were written from 65 to 95 CE. Mark, the Gospel of Mark, was written first. Revelation written last. Luke, Acts makes up about a third of the volume of the New Testament. And John was the last gospel written somewhere around 90. So during the life of the apostles, these letters were considered sacred. It wasn't just afterwards that these letters were considered sacred. In 2 Peter 3:16, Peter refers to Paul's letters as scripture. So after the death of John, at the end of the apostolic age, the early church took these 27 letters, they regarded them as authoritative, and they began making copies of them. And the first formal list of scripture, the first, not really the first, but the first formal presentation of a Christian canon that included the Old Testament and the New Testament, 39 books of the Old Testament, the 27 of the New, was put out by Athanasius in the 4th century. Athanasius didn't compile this list on his own. Athanasius merely presented the canon that was circulating in the church. So I just wanted to say that because that's important to the early formation of Christianity, was when they began to accept these letters from Peter and Paul and the Gospels and John. When they began to accept these as sacred literature for doctrine immediately, even during the life of the apostles that wrote them. So during the first 300 years of Christianity, the church went from finding itself on the receiving end of pressure from Rome to slowly gaining influence. This influence and this relaxation of persecution was fueled by the apologies, right? These men who would write these wonderful letters in defense of Christianity. It was fueled by the virtuous activity of the early Christians, feeding the homeless, taking care of the widows, saving babies, staying married, not participating in orgies, these things that they would do. And it was fueled by aggressive evangelism and discipleship. And most churches by the 2nd or 3rd century had developed a very formal process for how to incorporate new converts into the church. They would physically segregate these congregants. Sometimes they would make them wear white. They had a year-long teaching where they would have to learn doctrine and have to learn scripture. And during this year, the elders of the church would constantly observe their life and what they did for a living and their behavior, their ethical behavior, how they treated their neighbor, how they treated their wife, all these things. And after this year, if they were accepted into the congregation, they were baptized and then they were given their first communion. So the church grew through evangelism, through discipleship. And up to the year 312, the church was a minority religion, technically an illegal religion. And since they were considered atheist, the main thing that the church focused on was evangelism, discipleship, Christian ministry, and survival, just surviving, right? But that all changed in 312. So in the year 312, Emperor Constantine, getting ready to do battle in France, I believe it was France, had a vision of a cross in the sky, and written under the cross, the words, in this sign, conquer. A cross, and then in this sign, conquer. And in that moment, the emperor of the Roman Empire converted to Christianity. And in that moment, Christianity went from being an illegal religion, struggling to survive, to being the religion of the empire. And this had lasting effects on Christianity. The church grew in numbers because people wanted to practice the religion of the empire. You had this influx of people that would come to the churches, this influx of people that wanted to be baptized. And the church struggled to keep up with that. So the church was growing in numbers, but the quality of the converts wasn't the same as it was before, because now you had people coming into the church because they wanted to practice the religion that the emperor practiced. And guys, this is how the majority of humans over history have practiced religion. They practice the religion of the king or the emperor. It's the king or the emperor that dictates the religion to the masses. And so it's no different. So the lack of persecution caused numerical growth in the church, which caused, and we'll talk about this in the next lecture, but it caused a greater need for leadership in the church. And so you really see the office of bishop take off and begin to grow. And now that the emperor, over the next decade or so, now that the emperor is a Christian and persecution is really relaxed, the church shifts its focus from survival to exploring the intricacies of Christian doctrine. And the first real test of, not the first, but the first big test of Christian doctrine came when a deacon in the church in Alexandria, Egypt, named Arius, began teaching that Jesus did not have a dual nature. In other words, Jesus was not fully God and fully man. It was a very significant controversy. It took up a lot of time of the bishops. There were a lot of Christian churches that followed Arius. I think at one point, there may have even been more churches that believed what Arius believed than believed what eventually became the Orthodox position. And so because this was causing such a stir, Constantine told the bishop he wanted them to convene a council of all bishops to debate and settle the issue. So the first ecumenical council, the first church council, other than the one in Acts 15, there was a church council as well, was convened in 325 at Nicaea, and the bishops overwhelmingly ruled against Arianism. In other words, they came out of that council affirming the divinity of Jesus. From that council, they issued a creed, and you may have heard this creed. We believe in one God, the Father Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and of all things visible and invisible, and in one Lord Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the only begotten of the Father before all ages, light of light, true God of true God, begotten, not made, of one essence. That's a very important statement. Of one essence with the Father, by whom all things were made, who for us men and for our salvation came down from heaven and was incarnate of the Holy Spirit and the Virgin Mary and became a man. And he was crucified for us under Pontius Pilate and suffered and was buried. And the third day he rose again according to the Scriptures and ascended into heaven and sits at the right hand of the Father. And he shall come again with glory to judge the living and the dead, whose kingdom shall have no end. And this creed established the first major theological statement from the Christian church since the penning of the New Testament. And it established a basis for Christology that would develop through history. So, jumped around a little bit, but we just covered from Pentecost to the year 325. We covered the early growth of the church. We covered the early leadership of the church. We covered the formation of the New Testament. We covered persecution. We covered a response to persecution. We covered the conversion of Constantine, and we covered a response to Arianism, which was the Nicene Creed. I cannot overstate how important the first 300 years of Christianity is to Christianity. And as we move forward in this course, we will spend more time talking about how various attempts have been made in the church to get back to apostolic Christianity. So that is the lecture. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. Hang around for just a minute and try to make sure I answer all your questions and drink some coffee. All right, I don't see any questions. I don't know how long it takes to pop up. But if you have questions that don't get answered before I stop talking, you can always email me. But appreciate you guys being here tonight. Look forward to the next lecture. I'll try to be a little more brief in the next lecture, but there was a lot of background information that I wanted to cover in this lecture, like all the stuff about the different empires that arose, the formation of the canon, stuff like that. So I knew this is going to be a beefy lecture. Subsequent lectures won't be quite as dense. So, howdy, Professor. What was the response to persecution? If you're talking about the church's response, the church's response was to double down on apologies, right? Writing the apologies, was to double down on ethical behavior, and was to double down on evangelism and discipleship. The response was to continue to be the hands and feet of Jesus to the world, and to continue to preach the gospel and baptize new converts and disciple them. That was the response. The formal response really were the apologists, those men that wrote apologies. But they recognized that they had a significant task ahead of them. Now, so, there are some other responses. For instance, the way that the Christians conducted themselves when they were put in the arena was had a significant impact on the populations of those areas that witnessed the Christians in the arena. And this book is full of them. You have I won't get into it, but the way that they seemed to embrace martyrdom, the joy of suffering for Jesus was a real component of the theology of early Christians. And martyrs were celebrated. Christians would gather at the catacombs, would gather at the graves, at the tombs of these martyrs, and celebrate communion. Like it was a high honor, as far as they were concerned, to follow Jesus in suffering. And so the response to the persecution eventually revealed that whatever the rumors were, these were good people. And eventually the misunderstanding subsided, particularly with the conversion of Constantine. I hope that answers your question. But there's a Fox's Book of Christian Martyrs. It's an older book. I don't even know when it was written, but I used to have a copy. I don't have a copy anymore. I'm not sure. I'm not saying it's not accurate, but I'm not sure how accurate some of the stories in Fox's Book of Christian Martyrs is, but it covers a lot of stories from the history of Christianity about Christian martyrs. And I would encourage you, if you get a chance, to get the Apostolic Fathers and read through some of those stories of Christians that were martyred and how they responded to the martyrdom. Like not having to be tied to the stake to be burned, things like that. Like it's incredible. So, all right. So if that's it, we're going to say good night, and I'm going to end this stream and pray to Jesus that this saves to my channel, because I am not doing this again. All right. You guys have a good night. And if you need me, always reach out to me. You can text or call or send me an email. But Thanks for showing up. See you later.